Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karen Ruprecht with the State Capacity Building Center, and welcome to the Top 10 Actions to Improve Website Content and Design webinar. This webinar, as many of you may know, is part of the Hot Topics in Consumer Education website series, and it's designed to bring you new information and resources in order to help you enhance your consumer education website. This series started in April, and it runs through December, so there's still plenty of opportunities to participate in a variety of webinars. This series showcases topics, such as the one today, that are a mix of best practices and required elements of the consumer education website. Our goal is to give you ways in which you can enhance how families, child care providers, and other stakeholders experience your website. We want to make sure you check the webinar announcement so that you can alert the right staff to be on these calls. Some of these webinars are a little bit more technical in nature, so you will probably want to have your IT people or your communications staff or other stakeholders listen in so that they can take full advantage of the information and the resources that we share in these webinars. We'll put the link to the webinar series in the chat box momentarily so that you can access it. And this link will also take you to our resource page where you find new resources on how to enhance your consumer education website. And it also lists the past recordings of PowerPoints from the previous webinars, just in case you wanted to look at some of those as well. So throughout the webinar today, we'd like you to use the chat feature that's on the webinar site to type in questions that you might have on this topic. We'll remind you throughout the webinar to do so periodically, and we'll take your questions and sort through them. And in 2 weeks from today, on August 22nd, from 2 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll answer as many questions as we can in an Ask Me Anything webinar. So if you think of questions after the webinar, which happens, don't worry. You can email us, and we'll also give you that email at the end of the webinar, too, if you have a question that pops up after the webinar. So I want to introduce our speakers here today. As I mentioned, I'm Karen Ruprecht with the State Capacity Building Center, and today we have with us Clem Ayung from ICFNet, Jennifer Drake with the National Center on Parent, Family, and Community Engagement, and we have a special guest, Jennifer Towle, with Child Care Services at the Oklahoma Department of Human Services, and she'll talk a little bit about what they've been doing in Oklahoma around one of these top 10 actions that we'll talk about here in just a moment. So as many of you know, we like to start off our webinars by knowing who is with us here today. So I'm going to ask Violetta to pull up our first poll, and if you wouldn't mind just sharing with us your position or role, and there's a variety of topics to choose from, or roles rather, a community member, a direct child serving practitioner, family, state government, a state level professional but not in state government, T&TA provider. If you could just take a moment and complete that. Looks like a majority of the folks on the line with us today are in state government, and then a few T&TA professionals and state level professionals outside of state government, and a couple others from CPR and our network and so on. So thank you for sharing your role. We appreciate that. And Violetta, thanks for changing that back for me. So as we get started today, we want you to think about this slide and this graphic about moving from compliance to a commitment to quality. So we want to start today by talking about the idea of moving beyond compliance. Proving how someone uses your website and how it helps them find the right child care option, for example, requires more than just having all the information on your website or making your website accessible for people with disabilities. Instead, today, we want to center these 10 actions that Jennifer Drake and Jennifer Towle will share with you around improving the quality of your consumer education website. At the end of the day, what any website does is to build trust with their audience so that they will see your information and resources as valuable, useful, and reliable. And hopefully, they'll think of your consumer education website first and turn to it to answer their questions. So as we walk through these 10 actions together, we hope that they will jumpstart some ideas about how you can raise the quality of experiences with your target audiences. whether it's parents or child care providers. So we want you to think about that so when they use your website to answer questions that they may have. So one of the main ideas around creating quality experiences on your website is really about making the information on your site as actionable as possible. So every piece of information on your website should help your target audience, again, whether that's families or child care providers, do something to achieve their goals. For example, compliance might mean having all of the required information on your website, but quality means helping your audience find what they need, understand what they find, like using language that they're familiar with, and use what they find to fulfill the reasons they came to your website in the first place. As a visitor of your website, think about this question, and this is the second bullet point. What can I do next after I read this content? So we want to be able to treat information as a verb and not as a noun. It shouldn't simply exist. It should help people do something that they want or need to do. So as you go through this webinar today, we want you to think about these 3 questions here that are on this slide. And this will help you kind of assess your own website. So first, does my website support the reasons people come to visit in the first place? Every visitor has a reason for visiting your website, even if they're just curious about what information is on your website. Second, ask yourself, does the website help people complete a task, taking into account how they want to complete it and when? So if they stick around, does your website support how they prefer to consume the information and how they expect the website to be organized? So think about that as you're going through these top 10 actions today. And finally, does my website use words that people can easily understand? Is it clear what people can do next? This is a really important point, and we've talked about this a couple of times through our other webinars. And a lot of times we do make assumptions about words our audience knows and the knowledge level about child care they bring when they're visiting our website. So we want to make sure they're making an informed decision after they land on a web page, for example, and using plain language will really help people make those informed choices. So this is just a preview of the top 10 actions that Clem and Jennifer are going to cover with you today. These actions are based on good practices developed over years of research. And remember that the point here is to continually improve your website, so these aren't necessarily actions that you have to take all at once. So without any further ado, let's get started, and I'll hand it off to Clem to talk to you about the first action.
Actually, Karen, it's Jennifer. And
oh,
hello,
I'm so sorry.
And that's okay. Probably the most important action we can take to improve the quality of our websites is to understand our audience, to gather and respond to input from our audiences. Sometimes we make assumptions, as you said, about what they need or what they're trying to do, and mismatches between what families and others are actually looking for or trying to do and what we think they need can create frustrating web experiences for them. So your audience isn't just anyone using your website. You want to be as specific as you can so it's easier to tell if you're meeting their needs and expectations. So think about how well do you know them. To start, they could be families, providers, child care advocates, others. But if you can be more specific, for example, every family is facing a different situation. So you can think about grouping your audience by common qualities or experiences. However you segment your website visitors, you want to understand things about them like what questions they have, what they came to your site to do. Parents have different questions than providers, and even parents have different questions from one family to another. Questions that they're trying to answer based on the needs of their child, their financial situation, where they work, etc. So here's some things about your target audience that you'll want to know. The more you know, the easier it is to prioritize which information to highlight. tasks your site should be supporting and how to organize or group pages on your site so they make sense to your audience. There's no best method to talk to your audience. To see the full picture and to best understand your audience, you'll want to use multiple methods to gather input. For example, if you want to learn about why someone visited your site, free surveys can be helpful. One-on-one interviews will get you more in-depth answers. For finding out which pages accumulated the most visits and which pages on your site that people landed on first, your web analytics can tell you that. We can't go super deep into researching your audience today, but we'll share some resources later that include in-depth information on this topic. Now, Jennifer Towle from Oklahoma is going to share a little bit about how they used a method called card sorting to reorganize and streamline pages on their website. Jennifer?
Hello. In Oklahoma, we used a method called card sorting, which is where you take, here we go. It's categorizing page and topics that are covered on your website. And what we wanted to do was to, we put our website up with all the information to be compliant, and then we just started to feel like it was too much information. And so we wanted to get some stakeholder feedback so that we could make changes. And so what we did was we took several of our main topics, headers, and put them on cards, and some of them we grouped together. And we had a meeting with stakeholders and developed scenarios from a parent perspective, a provider perspective, and the public perspective. And at the meeting, there were people that represented each group. And we had a note taker with each small group, and we didn't have more than 6 people in the small group. And what we did was we gave them the cards with the headers, and then they had to sort them based on the scenario of how they were going to try to find the information that they needed and the easiest way to locate that. And so for the first one, we didn't give them a scenario. We just said, what would you think you would find going to the website? And then we would debrief after that. So we left about 15 minutes after each debrief. And so after the first one, they were like, oh, this is very overwhelming, and it's kind of like how we felt about our website. And then when we gave them each specific scenarios, what we discovered from that in the debrief is that in each category, there were different components that they felt like either we were still missing or that things really didn't group well together. And so we got a lot of good feedback about how to realign the website, and as well as different resources that maybe we had left off that were really important to have for the different categories of parents, providers, and the public. Another thing that we did, or that we're doing here in Oklahoma, is instead of doing a survey of our website, we're going to do a treasure hunt. And so we have a treasure hunt developed that we're going to put out on social media, as well as to everyone within our agency and all of our partners, promoting this treasure hunt. And again, it's designed for the 3 categories, parents, providers, and the public. And there's tasks for each of them. And if they complete all 3 tasks, giving their feedback, then they're eligible to, and they give us their email, they'll be eligible to get a gift card to Lakeshore or Barnes & Noble. And so we're using that as well to get the feedback about our website so that we can make all the changes in order for it to be more user-friendly and have the information that the public really feels like they need to have.
Thanks for that great example, Jennifer. Appreciate you sharing about your work in Oklahoma. So this Foundations for Quality Consumer Education and Engagement series is a collection of resources from the National Center on Parent-Family Community Engagement, and it's designed to support states, territories, tribes, and their partners in developing and implementing effective family-friendly consumer education and engagement strategies. And the series includes an orientation to consumer engagement that provides definitions and concepts to help you build a shared understanding of both consumer education and engagement. That's a good place to start. Strategies for consumer engagement is one of the resources you can use to inform your audience research efforts, and it's all about ways to gather input and partner with families to inform your consumer education. The Family-Friendly Website Guide offers tips and strategies to make your website easier for families to use and understand. And it includes sample strength-based messages, which, based on our own consumer engagement work, really resonate well with families and help them feel welcomed when they first land on your pages and continue to explore the information. And then the Social Media Guide offers strategies for creating a social media plan and lots of tips for creating posts and engaging with your audience after you post. I'll turn the presentation over to Clem now.
All right, great. Thank you, Jennifer. So, stepping into the, shoes of parents and providers, and even subgroups of parents, you probably have a better understanding of their frustrations and questions and concerns that they have. But now, how does that influence their behavior? Their behavior can tell us how they prefer to engage with your information, products, services that's being offered on your website. And one kind of the behavior that we want to pay more attention to, I think, is to how they find your website. So people use different ways of reaching your consumer education website, and one of those ways might be search engines like Google and Bing, social media platforms, other websites from an external link, or even word of mouth. Getting information from other people and to find your website. But your website can have the most useful information, but people need to know that it exists because if people can't really find your website, and they won't be reading your content. So what we want to think about is which channels your audience use more than others, so that you can optimize those channels first, make sure that people are landing on your site. And usually, we can find that information through your web analytics. It can tell you which channels send the most people to your site. And while, we won't go over digital engagement in depth in this webinar, we created 2 resource guides on digital analytics and also search engine optimization with more information. And these are the 2 guides which is already made available on the website that Karen shared in the chat, and I encourage you guys to check that out. But outside of reading these resource guides entirely, here are a couple of things that you can do right now. One is to find out how your target audience typically reach your website and how many use that channel to do that. So you might find out you're spending a lot of time on Facebook optimizing your page, but in reality, your visitors are visiting a link from another website to reach your site. So you want to be able to map different sources of traffic to your website so that you're spending your time effectively. And sometimes using analytics to find out which channels are the most popular will help you manage your time and efforts in reaching your audience. Secondly, you might want to search for a page of your website using phrases that your audience might use, or type in a search box like, I need, for example, childcare for my deaf child, or how do I apply for childcare benefits? And then kind of see where the page ranks in the search engine results page. And you want to be able to ask questions like, does my page actually show up on the results page? If so, where on the results page? And also, how many results pages do I have to click through before reaching, the first relevant page on your website? Because it's important to think about that, because people typically only look at the first few pages on the search engine results page, and getting your page on the first page will increase the chance that your audience will see it. And also, while on the results page, you also want to check how your website is being described, because people will use that description to judge whether your page is relevant to their search. And these snippets about a page is called metadata. And you want each of your websites to have a unique one, or just have one in general. And here's an example of metadata. And this is an example of one search result on the Google search results page for the Google Chrome browser. And I want us to focus on two things, one being the page title and the other being meta description. Both are a type of metadata, and you want to be able to check to see, does my page title and my meta description make sense? Does it accurately describe the page and what the content that's on the page? And is it also, short and concise and in everyday language that people, my audience, can understand? Usually there are character limits to some of the character limits to the metadata. So sometimes you see pages with cutoff meta description and meta title with ellipses, and that's going to make it harder for your audience to judge the relevancy of your page to their needs. And especially for meta description, it should be unique for each page. You want to check your metadata to see if it's written, for humans, is it understandable for humans, but also work for the algorithms that power search engines. So, after your audience find your site, what happens next? Our job then becomes to help them, find and absorb the information so they can make smart decisions through your website. But do you ever notice that you're in your house, things are hard to find the more stuff you have? It's similar with websites, but now you have kind of an infinite closet space for things. And government websites usually just tend to have a lot of information for people to find their way through. So we want to think about doing a little spring cleaning, which help people find the things that they're actually looking for to answer their questions, which action 3 is really what it's all about. So first, what we want to find out is how much content do you actually have, and what is the quality of that content. So through that process, you get both quantitative and qualitative data. So what I mean by that is, by quantitative, you might do an inventory of how many pages do you have on your site, and also how many pages do people have to sort through to find what they need. And for the qualitative data, I'm kind of referring to the audit that you might do to gauge how the more subjective aspect of your content, is it accurate? Is it relevant? Is it written in plain language? And these are some of the criteria that I'm providing right now, but the criteria you'll choose really depends on your organizational goals and also the current conditions of your consumer education website. Secondly, you don't have to do evaluate your web pages all at once. You can, if you don't have time to devote to this, doing that your entire website, you might only focus on a section that is deemed high priority or needs a lot of attention. So just do one section at a time is perfectly fine. And finally, doing this activity will get you a lot of insight, but it's also sometimes a tedious work. So if possible, we want to be thinking about, is there a way to automate the inventory of pages on your website? And there are software that that you can use to do that, which I won't speak to right now. But I think the important idea is that inventory could be automated, but the auditing the quality of your content really should be done by a person or a group of people. Because I think the insight that you get is you really want to be familiar with the content. So on your site, so they can judge whether you're keeping something, you're revising something, or you are updating information on your site. And this is an example of a template that we've used to conduct an inventory and audit of the content. We usually customize it with analytics data, organizational goals, and other requirements that we get from other stakeholders. And we plan to make this template available after the webinar. It's not. I think we'll have to revise it a little bit before we can release it. But this is an example that you can use soon. But I think the important thing is the value of doing this really is in the collaborative decision making that comes out of the process, and you want to make decisions about whether your content is redundant, outdated, or trivial with your stakeholders. And some of these action items might be consolidating content that's duplicative, updating incorrect content like the contact information if it's out of date. You might also think about moving or removing content that the target audience don't need at the moment to reduce clutter on your site. And sometimes you might decide that the content needs to be rewritten, so you might need to use your audience insights to rewrite content in a way that is helpful or relevant to what they're trying to accomplish on the site. And I'm going to pass the slide back to Jennifer to talk about Action 4.
Yeah, thanks, Clem. So as you work to enhance your content, it's a good time to make sure the information is organized in a way that prioritizes what matters most to your audience. Your audience came to or landed on the page to answer their questions. So you want to get to the point quickly. And you can do this by arranging your content so that general information comes first, then in-depth supporting and clarifying information follows. Know which pages the audience landed on most often so you can figure out how to make those pages easier for them to find. And analytics can tell you top pages that your audience visits. You can bold and italicize or use color, size, and placement to focus people's attention visually on the content and the actions you want them to notice most. One way to check is to try squinting or stepping back from the screen to see what you notice most, what sticks out as the most important. Let's use this page from childcare.gov as an example. What are your eyes drawn to on this page? Is it the information that's most important? You probably noticed the page title and the big button to the left. That's what's highlighted in this arrangement. Also, when updating your content, pay attention to incorporating plain language writing so that your content can be understood by more people. The example here is a sentence using double negatives. See how the left sentence takes more brain power and the example on the right is clearer and shorter. Here's some tips for plain language writing. For more suggestions and examples, I encourage you to check out plainlanguage.gov. It's a great resource. And another thing to think about in terms of plain language is jargon. And in our field, we use a lot of jargon to communicate with one another, like QRIS and subsidy, and parents and others may not be familiar with or use these terms in the same way. They might use a different term for subsidy, for example, voucher or assistance. So it can be helpful to make a list and then swap with replacement words that more people may understand, like the examples here. And add these words to your style guide or your communication guide to use on an ongoing basis. Now back to Clem.
All right, thank you, Jennifer. So, we talked about writing in plain language, but, besides writing content in a way that's understandable, we also want to think systematically about our content. So rather than thinking in terms of individual pages, we want to be thinking about people's journey through different pages on the site, which, so for action 6, we want, to be checking for dead ends and confusing navigation. So you consider your audience's journeys. Think of yourself as a tour guide. What clues do you want to give people to help them navigate your site? Also think about what important things or interesting things do you want to point out along their journey. And answering those questions is easier if you understand your audience's interests and reasons for visiting your site. Some of the things that we talked about earlier in the presentation. But some of the clues that your audience will pay attention to when they land your site are, for example, different menu categories and what's in them. So if you think of a zoo, right? Like there is different exhibits, like a safari, the aquarium, etc. And there's like usually different parks for each. In a way, in a similar way, we want to think about your website having different zones and different categories for people to visit. And I think we want to pay attention to, how those categories are grouped in a way that makes sense for your audience. Along with categories, we also want to think about the labels for navigation, links, and buttons. So if we use a zoo example again, it's the description of the exhibit, right? So if you want to make the labels understandable for your audience, we might use common names for, say, the exhibit versus like more Latin or scientific name for different animals and species that's contained in the exhibit. And another thing that I think people do look for as clues is the visual landmarks that signal their current location in your site and how they got there at their current location. So these are the "you are here" kind of markers on the map that you see sometimes, or like signposts, that help direct flow of traffic in places like museums and subways. Otherwise, internal external links in the main content area also helps people understand where they are and where they want to go next if they want to get more specific details around the topic. An example here is, if you look at the example on your left, it's a section of a navigation menu on childcare.gov. You can see that it has a clear label with a drop-down feature to let people know that there are additional items under this label, which are just other areas that they can explore. And on the right side, there is the entire snapshot of the a page on childcare.gov with a page called 5 Steps to Choosing Care. On on the left-hand menu items, if you can see, the menu labels are pretty distinct, so that people aren't confused which area to look at to find what they need. And the people's current location is highlighted in blue, so it's clear that they're on that page at the moment. And in the body paragraph, there are several links, internal links, that people can go to if they want more information, or if they want to dig into a topic that is in the text. So, navigation, I think, is really, and when you think about it, it's really about, meeting people's expectations of where they'll find the information they need. And there are certain practices that provide better clues to people so they can find the information more quickly. One being, ensuring the content is organized into mutually exclusive categories. Like, if two menu items, are named similarly, that could be confusing for people because they have to guess which category to look into, and that just adds an extra step to what they want to accomplish. I'm also using task-based menu labels. Usually that means using labels that start with a verb. So for example, like apply for childcare benefits is a little bit more clear on what they can do than just saying childcare benefits. And that's just one example of a task-based menu label. Otherwise, doing a broken link scan so that people aren't surprised that they reach an error page. That could be a little bit jarring, for navigation. Also visually indicating people's location in the menu, and also providing breadcrumb navigation and how they, which is basically telling them like how they reached the current page, and if they want to trace back to a previous page, it's pretty easy to do that with a breadcrumb navigation. And finally, writing descriptive link text, which includes keywords that your audience recognizes, also helps them predict where they're going, and if where they're going is where they actually want to go. So we talked about navigation a lot, and but I think this topic is especially important for people with disabilities. So in Action 7, we want to be ensuring that your website is accessible and supports people with varying levels of physical and cognitive abilities. So depending on their ability, someone might rely on different accessibility features to use your website. So one of them might be a screen reader for people with vision impaired or low vision, or people who are dealing with vision impairment or low vision. They might need the content to be read aloud to them. Otherwise, they might look for color contrast, enough color contrast between the background and the foreground so they can tell, so they can read the content and have it more readable. Otherwise, another person might be have hearing impairment or is deaf, and they might rely more on words to absorb the information in your site. So plain language is really important for them, and also providing closed captions and transcripts for video and audio is important for helping them understand information and absorb it. For people with limited mobility, they usually have trouble using mouse and a trackpad. So making sure that your website is navigable by only keyboard is important for supporting people with limited mobility. And lastly, people with cognitive difficulties or dyslexia, I think plain language is going to be especially important for them. For helping them absorb information. So we need to pay more attention to that. But otherwise, we might offer alternative media formats to help them consume information in other ways, because they might take in that information more easily than reading. And maybe some of you might remember, but we did put on a webinar on accessibility about a month ago. So there's a recording and a resource guide, which will give you more in-depth information on accessibility, and I encourage you guys to check that out. As a reminder, accessible government website is required by Section 508, which I won't go into at the moment. And it's also a CCDF final rule requirement as well. So it's, I think, something that's really important to think about and prioritize if you're making website improvements right now. But this is an optional activity that you can take, you can do maybe after the presentation if you like. But this activity is really designed to help you put yourself in the shoes of a parent who have limited mobility and see, how they feel if they can't, just point and click and select something in the menu item. So for action 8, we want to think about organizing information around your audience's top tasks. People really, are here when they land on their site, like they're really here to, make a decision. Perhaps decision about what options to choose, what steps to take. So, we want to make sure that your content answers people's questions, are easy to follow, and helps them predict the outcome of taking action. And the easiest way to do that is to get specific about the most important or the most frequent tasks that your audience wants to complete on your site. So here are some of the ways to empower your audience to choose the right options for them. As people, one is to break up complex tasks into smaller steps, so that it's easy to follow along. We also, there's a lot of information on government websites, so you don't really want to overwhelm people with too many options all at once. So, one of the ways is to think, about being the best customer experience or best customer service representative that you can be, and kind of see your site from that perspective. And, as people make progress, we want to be pointing out steps that people are on and like how far they have to go so they know where they're at and how much, they have to they're left to go to complete, a task. We also want to be thinking about writing descriptive and meaningful button labels that say exactly what will happen. So this is around like avoiding vague button labels like learn more, because it kind of begs the question of like learn more about what. So being specific really helps people make the right decisions, and I think like different, being more specific with word choice specifically will help your audience predict what will happen after they click on it. Third, we want to let people know if an action was successful after they press the button. So, for example, this is common in forms that you might have to submit, or if you have a search engine for providers in your state, that's something that you might have to consider. And lastly, if needed, we want to be writing concise instructions in plain language so that people are less likely to make mistakes. And sometimes instructions is best written if it includes benefits of taking an action and also why it's important to take this certain action. An example here is also from childcare.gov. This is on writing meaningful, descriptive, and descriptive button labels. And we're comparing two different buttons to see which one is clear. If you look at the right side, this button, takes, if you click on submit, like it takes people to a resource page in the state of Pennsylvania, but the submit doesn't really quite communicate, the end result well. And so what might be clear might be to say, see resources from Pennsylvania, kind of talking back to the specificity of button labels. because it tells people exactly what they'll find, and that's kind of the level of specificity that I think is more important in this context. And if you look at the left button, it says find childcare now in Oregon, and this label is specific and clear because it tells people that they can start searching for providers immediately in the state of Oregon. So word choice and specificity really matters in making your site more usable and also user-friendly. So up to this point, I've been using examples of websites in a desktop version, but it's also important to check how your website looks and functions on mobile devices. This is analytics data for childcare.gov. And then you can see in the first row, more than 50% of the visitors are accessing the site from their mobile phones compared to desktop. And I think the point here is like, while it might be different on your consumer education website, depending on your target audience's behavior, there's probably some portion of the audience that you want to use your site on their mobile devices, and that's something I think to keep in mind as you improve your site. So here are some of the questions you can ask to kind of gauge how mobile friendly your website is. One being, do links and buttons and form fields have enough space for fingers? So sometimes if buttons are too close together, people might hit one by accident, so that might be frustrating for them. And then is the menu, still clear and accessible on mobile, when you view your site on mobile devices? So I think this idea is if it looks complicated on your desktop, it's probably more complicated on mobile devices. So maybe you can, use methods like cart sorting to simplify your menu, etc. So just want to pay attention to your menu to navigate around your site. Otherwise, our text, images, and tables resize so they're not cut off by a smaller screen size. Our images and graphics optimized to reduce, page load time. So sometimes images are not compressed, so it may, if it has a large file size, it might slow down your site when there's a low cellular bandwidth or bad internet connection. So it's something else to pay attention to. Lastly, if you have dynamic elements like hover states, we want to make sure that responsive touch, for example, on your phone. So if you use the hover state example, hover states should be converted into a touch interaction so that people can still see the content, even though they're not hovering over like a text or icon. And also one other note is that search engines like Google rank mobile-friendly websites higher. So it's really important to optimize your site for mobile for search engine optimization purposes. This is another optional activity. We won't do this now, but I think this basically, this exercise, I think will help you compare your desktop and your mobile version of the site and see, if the experience is different for your audiences. So something to try after this webinar. And action 10, finally, is testing and measuring your changes. So if you're making changes to your website, you want to check if changes are actually improving people's experiences, as well as helping you reach organizational goals. So, how do we do that? That usually means taking a look at your analytics to see how people are actually using your site. This is an example of Google Analytics dashboard for the Early Childhood Training and Technical Assistance Systems website. It's a mouthful. But some of the metrics you see here are page views, average time on page, and bounce rate. And they all kind of tell you something different. about your audience's behavior in site. So for example, if you look at page views, you can infer that the page with the most views are the most valuable or the useful to your audience. But that's not always the case, right? Like people might land on a page by accident, thinking that they'll find an information they need on that page, while it may not be. So you never really want to look at metric in isolation. That's kind of like looking at only one spot in a painting. You're not really getting the full picture. So I think another thing to think about is like there are so many metrics that you can track, but you really only want to focus on those that matter to your organization and those that paint an accurate picture of your progress on your goals. So really be mindful about choosing goals that really matter to your organization. Otherwise, you might get overwhelmed as well. So, the first really step is to set your goals, set your goals with your team so it's collaborative. But beyond that, you want to pick the right metrics to track to measure your progress towards your goals, and also what the data will decide for next steps. And then after that, we want to measure kind of baseline numbers to see if so you can measure, I think, improvements on your site. So you have baseline numbers to compare against if you're making progress. And then next would be probably setting cadence for monitoring analytics, which means like how often you will want to record your metrics data. And finally, getting feedback directly from your target audience. So sometimes you need to do that instead of relying on quantitative metrics. So analytics data are quantitative data. They're actually latent indicators, which means they only tell you what happened in the past. So to get more context about why something is happening, or what else you can do to help you reach your goal, you'll need to reach out to your audience members and get the qualitative side of data to give you, again, like the full picture of your progress towards your goals. An example of what we just went over, for example, we might set a goal to increase downloads of new parent education resource. The metric for that might be, for example, events like, clicks on a button, like download button, bounce rate, referral sources. And I won't go into each metric individually, but say if you optimize a page for search engines, you're going to be thinking about, are more visitors coming from search and landing on that page? And to see, which tactics are working, maybe say if you are doing a campaign to promote your resource on Facebook and also on the email newsletter, maybe you want to see which channel is bringing in more visits to the page to increase the chances that people will download your resource. And I think the metrics, I think, at the end will help you see what's working, what's not. And you probably want to track your progress for over several months to see if the impact has longevity. And for impact, you want to make sure that you know what to do after you record progress. So some of the changes that you might make might be like changing your call to action or the button label, or clarifying the benefits of downloading a resource, etc. So I think, overall, I think the idea here is that, it's really about forming a hypothesis about what optimization will make an impact and then seeing if it really does. So I'm going to hand, these are resource summary that you guys can take a look. But at this time, I'm going to hand the mic back to Karen.
Great. Thank you so much, Clem. Clem and Jennifer Drake and Jennifer Tall, you've given us so much to think about, I think, in terms of how we can improve consumer education websites using some of these top 10 actions. So thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today. I'd like to encourage folks to continue to enter questions into the chat box. I know we didn't quite get to all of them. Sometimes it's a balance of doing the presentation and trying to answer the questions at the same time, but we will most definitely get to the questions in the Ask Me Anything webinar. But I do want to draw your attention to these resources that we have available for you right now. Jennifer Drake mentioned a couple of the resources from the National Center on Parent, Family, and Community Engagement, and that's listed here along with the link to those resources. Earlier in the webinar, I mentioned some resources that we have at the Child Care State Capacity Building Center, specifically on consumer education websites, and those resources are listed here for you as well as the recording from some of the past webinars that we've conducted since April of this year. So as we close out today, we like to end with a couple of polls, and I'll ask Violetta to pull those up for us. But we'd like to ask you how much of your understanding about this topic today improved as a result of this webinar. So if you could just take a moment, please, and select your option. It really helps us think about how to improve the content for our future webinars through these evaluation questions. Great. And then Violetta, if you could pull up the next poll that we have for you. Our next question is, how likely are you to use these strategies in the future for your work with consumer education websites? Great. And we do have one more poll. I'll just have Violetta pull up that last one for ease of navigation on our own end. But this is our open-ended question about what additional webinar topics would be of interest to you. It could be within the topic of consumer education, or it could be a broader topic that you're thinking of. But if you have any additional webinar topics that you think might be of interest to you and your stakeholders within your state or territory, please let us know. And we'll give you a moment or two to answer that. Great. And if you continue to have additional topics that are of interest to you, we do encourage you to contact us, and we will definitely include some more of those topics, hopefully, in the future webinar series. We do have some more coming in. So Violetta, I'll let you determine when it's ready to kind of go back to the presentation for the closing remarks. Great. And then, as I had mentioned earlier in the webinar, and I think both Clem and Jennifer maybe alluded to these as well, we will have a 30-minute Ask Me Anything webinar 2 weeks from today on August 22nd. So if we weren't able to get your questions, we will certainly answer them at that point. You could send questions to the Capacity Building Center email that's listed there, and it will also be in an email follow-up to you as well. Our webinar series continues in September, and in September we're partnering with our partners at the National Center for After School Enrichment, and we'll be talking about school-age care in your consumer education website and how you can include information about school-age care in your consumer education website. So we hope you join us then. Feel free to sign up to the webinar series in the link that I posted earlier. But on behalf of myself at the State Capacity Building Center, we'd like to thank Clem, Jennifer Drake, and Jennifer Towell for being with us here today. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a great day.